And where I'm going to start today in this kind of overview of child development as a science is with a simple sort of definition of development. And it's because I want us all to remember that we're not talking about a picture or a photograph of a child kind of frozen in time, sort of a static image of just one day. We're taking a developmental perspective. We're looking at changes in the child that occur over time. And we're really going to start before the child is born, thinking all the way back to genes and chromosomes and extending out in this class up through middle childhood at those kind of changes that unfold. Child development as a science examines two broad types of questions. One are questions that are designed to answer practical, real life kinds of questions. This is sometimes called applied questions. An example here is, what is the best way to teach children to read? So maybe we have some different ideas about ways to teach children. Let's evaluate and see which of these is most effective. The other type of question that's asked are more open-ended scientific kinds of questions. This is sometimes called basic questions. And these don't relate to a particular strategy or something that has a direct connection to a practice, but they're more open-ended. So what changes might take place during early childhood is an example of that kind of basic question. Now, because we're talking about a whole human being, it's hard for us to talk about everything that's going on with that person at one time. And so for that reason, the way our minds work is we segment things and we break them down into chunks that we can talk about and understand. And these are some common ways of sort of categorizing aspects of child development into different domains. And one of those domains involves biological processes, things like how our bodies grow, how do our genes and hormones impact our development, what is our physical growth and health like? An example might be physical skills, like how does a baby learn to sit up, or how does a preschooler learn to ride a bike? Another broad area of domains includes cognitive processes, things like how do we think? What is intelligence? How does language develop? An example here might be learning to count or to read. And the third of these categories or domains is social and emotional processes. How do emotions develop? How do we form a personality? How do we develop relationships with our parents and with our peers and friends? Examples here might be developing self-control or developing a sense of identity. Now, in this class, I organize these topics as sort of the structure of our weekly modules. So the first 5 weeks are kind of background in child development. What are the major theories in child development? What kind of research methods do we use to answer questions about child development? How do our biological underpinnings impact our development over time? Then you'll see there are 2 weeks that really focus more on that physical domain, about physical growth and the development of motor skills. There are 3 modules that focus more on that cognitive domain, and there are 3 more that focus more on that social and emotional domain. What I want to tell you right from the get-go is that while it's important and necessary for us to break down things into categories that we can think about and understand, those categories are kind of just make-believe. We're just making them up. In reality, we have a whole child, a whole human being, and development in biological, physical kinds of things, and development in cognitive and in social and emotional things don't carry along independently. They don't happen in isolation. In fact, they all interact with each other. They're all intertwined with each other. So physical development of the brain allows for cognitive and intellectual development. At the same time, things that we encounter in the environment, that intellectual development, directs how the physical development of our brain happens. Our interactions with our family and the language that we hear impacts the language that we develop, and our use of language impacts formation physically of connections in our brain. So these things, even though we talk about them as if they're separate kinds of processes, I want you to remember that really they interact, they meld together, and us separating them into ways that we can think about them is really sort of an artificial process. And another kind of artificial process that we put on is we break up periods of development in chunks that we organize in ways that make sense to us, uh, but just to help us to understand, to break down those processes of development. So let's talk about real quick what those different stages or periods of development might be. And we could break them down in different ways, uh, but this is an easy way of doing it. So the prenatal period is that time between conception and birth. Following birth up to about a year and a half, 2 years is a period of infancy. We could break down that period between 18 months and maybe 30 months into a sub period of toddlerhood, and that would be fine. That would be another word that we could use for children about age 2. The early childhood period is synonymous with the preschool years, so that's from about 2 months up to about age 5 or 6. Um, it depends on really how we're defining that. If we're defining it in terms of school entry, then we're probably going to say 5 because that's when kids enter kindergarten. If we're considering it in terms of maybe physical or emotional development, we might think of it as up to 6. Middle or late childhood, that corresponds to the elementary school years. So I'll often just say elementary schoolers in this class, but what I'm talking about is that middle childhood period from about 6 to about 11. And adolescence begins, and we could break adolescence up into different categories too of early, middle, and late. I'm not going to do this in this class because our focus really isn't on the adolescent period, but it begins about the transition to puberty, some of those hormonal changes there, anywhere from 10 to 12 years old up to college age, could be still in late adolescence, young adulthood. So in our class, we're going to go to this time of about 11 and about the end of elementary school, about the transition to middle childhood. And I keep saying about because it's always that crystal clear. So some research about some aspect or domain of child development might go to age 12, or might the transition to 6th grade might be an important component of understanding children's development. So sometimes we'll creep past that 11 years. It's not a hard cutoff. The last part that I wanted to get you to is that these development in these different periods of childhood and the development in those different domains, they interact and they carry forth over time. And what I'm trying to say is that let's take infancy. The physical development in infancy can relate to emotional development in early childhood. Cognitive development or language development in early childhood can relate to our social development and the peer relations as we transition into elementary school. So development in all of these periods predicts development later, and the interaction between these domains happens across time. It's not static. It doesn't happen like that snapshot. It happens like a movie that unfolds. I want to talk about some of the core issues, some of the core debates that goes on in the study of child development. And the primary one that many of you have heard of is nature and nurture. And that asks the question of why do we change? What drives our development? Is our development driven by our biology? Is it written, the map for our lives written in our genes? Or Is it nurture? Is it the the environments that we come into contact with? And if you think about it, this question relates very much to that discussion of developmentally appropriate practice we had last week, where we had here are the individual traits of the child, here are the age-related traits, here are the cultural traits. In many ways, that view of interaction between the two that we see in DAP is consistent with the current view of this idea of nature and nurture. Notice I didn't write nature versus nurture, which is what you often hear, because today most theorists and most researchers are able to say it's not one or the other. It's both in different ways. And so that's something that's going to come up again and again through this semester through all of our different topics. Another core issue is how do we change? How does development unfold? And there are two basic models here. One on the left is a continuous kind of change, continuity. Another way of saying this is quantitative, like numbers. And the example here is a pine tree. And when that pine tree is little, we have a little pine tree. It has little needles on it. Its trunk, its trunk, it's the trunk of the tree is covered in pine tree bark, right? And it grows into a bigger pine tree with bigger pine cones and bigger pieces of bark and bigger needles and bigger branches. But it's still a pine tree branch. And you can see this is kind of how a growth curve typically works. You see the growth in size starts to level out. So it doesn't go up like a straight line, it goes up like a curve because the growth slows down. But this is very linear. The small tree becomes a bigger tree, becomes a bigger tree. Another way that development can happen is like this example of a butterfly. This is discontinuity or qualitative change. So the linear continuous change is quantitative, like the pine tree. The butterfly, the discontinuous change, is qualitative. So think about a caterpillar. It's growing around, it's doing its thing, it's eating its leaves, and it's a caterpillar. And then one day, something changes and it makes a chrysalis and it goes into this cocoon. And now that caterpillar is different. And it's in the chrysalis for a little while and things are changing. And then it emerges a butterfly and it's different. A butterfly isn't just a bigger caterpillar. It's not a caterpillar with more, like this tree has more branches and bigger bark and thicker bark. This butterfly is different than this caterpillar. And there was this change, this stepwise qualitative change that happened. Another core issue is early versus later experience. And the question here is, what is more important in describing how this child will be doing in fifth grade? Is it more important to understand what they experienced early as an infant, or is it more important to understand what they did recently? What were they doing in fourth grade? Is that a better predictor? Uh, this is hotly debated, and there are different cultural views here as well. Some cultures really, if you think about it, focus on what happens early in life, setting a stage. Others focus more on what have you done lately. Another key question is universality and diversity. And the question here is, how are we alike as human beings? What is a human being thing? And how are we different? What is a cultural thing? So what about our traits are just a quality that we all share, that's just a part of being human? And what is more a reflection of our environment and culture? Some others very quickly. Stability versus plasticity means how malleable is this? Is this trait set in stone? Once it happens, the door shuts, the window closes, it's finished? Or is this plasticity means something is changeable, it's malleable, you can mold it over time? Another question is passive versus active child. Does development just happen to the child? Is the acted upon? So the child is very passive and just sort of the observer versus the active child. Does the child actively construct knowledge? Do they actively engage in driving their own development? And And finally, there, endpoint versus no endpoint. Do we get to a point where development's done? When y- as college students, are you done developing now? Are you finished? Or does development continue across the lifespan? In general, my advice to you is that it's not very wise to take the extreme position on any of these. It's not wise to say, "Oh, yep, it's nature," or "Yep, development has an endpoint," or "It doesn't." Because there are aspects of human development that look like all of these things. There are some things that look very much biologically driven, and some things that look very much like they're driven by our culture. There are some things that do have an endpoint. I'm not gonna grow any taller, but there's some things that don't have an endpoint. I can continue learning and read new things. So all of these characterize some aspect of development at some point through the human lifespan. So I want you to remember that child development is a science because of how it investigates children's development. And it's hard. Social sciences in general, like psychology and sociology, sometimes it's harder to think of using the scientific method in them than it is in a hard science like geology, because I can't just in geology, if I want to know if this rock is sandstone, I can weigh it, I can measure it, I can take the density of it, I can compare it to other pieces of sandstone. I can look at it under a microscope. If I want to know if this child's angry, well, that's really hard to chip off a little bit of anger and look at it under the microscope. So child development is even harder in that way, I think, than some of the other social sciences. And it's because we were all children. We we all know what childhood was like, and we all had families that raised us, and so we all have our own truths. We all know what was ideal or not ideal. We all have beliefs that we bring into our reading, and it's hard to know where our beliefs and our opinions stop and where our knowledge of child development begins. And so that's why it's important for us to look at research to clarify. And this is just an example of the scientific method. And you've known this since fifth or sixth grade, that we identify a problem, we gather some information, we collect our data, we draw conclusions based on evaluating those data, and then we revise our conclusions in theory. And remember that a theory is that set of coherent ideas. It's sort of a map. It's to try to explain something. Somebody made some observations and they thought they saw a pattern, and they made some general statements to explain those facts. A hypothesis is based in a theory, but it's a guess. It's an assumption that's testable. So it makes a prediction. I think this is what will happen, and you can test that prediction to see if it's supported or not. The final thing I want to talk about today is sort of social views of children. And this is going to lead us up to, over the next 2 weeks, talking about first research methods and second theories of child development. But I want to think about some big social views of children. And if you go back to things like ancient Greece or Egypt or Rome, we know from the art that they left us and the writings that they left us that they viewed children as sort of a special class of people, a protected class. We know that also from the ancient Chinese culture. We know it from some of the Native American cultures, that children were viewed as a special time, a special protected group of people that were different from adults. In Western society, by medieval times, we lost much of that view. Children were seen as sort of miniature adults. They were seen as not necessarily a special group that deserved special protection. And this was largely based upon that conception of original sin. that came from the Western worldview, that children were born into this world, they were born bad. They came in bad, and the role of society, of laws, of the church was to stamp the badness out of them and save them. And there were two philosophers who kind of challenged that notion during the Enlightenment. One was, and they were roughly contemporaneous, their lifetimes overlapped. One was an English person named John Locke. And John Locke said that children aren't born bad, they're born a blank slate. He used the Latin word tabula rasa, which just means a blank slate. And he thought that society could write on the child who they are, so that if you took a baby that was a child of aristocrats and a baby that was a child of beggars and thieves, you could switch them and raise them in those environments such that they would look like they belonged in that environment. Rousseau was a French person, and you have to remember this was the time when the European nations were beginning to become colonial, and they were exploring the world, and they were setting up colonies. And Rousseau was looking at some of the French colonies, like in Tahiti, and he thought that it wasn't that children were born bad. He thought that children were born inherently good, that we came into this world innocent, and that society was what made us bad. So he thought that we would go to the Europeans would go to these colonies and sort of contaminate the natural goodness of the people there. And this is just some art. This is a medieval picture here. And what this shows, if you look down at the bottom, you see those little bitty mini people. Those children are depicted as just tiny little adults. I don't know why everybody has a baby. The babies are different. But you see the adults, they're kind of the children, they're in the same physical uh, proportion as the adults. And there's that Rousseau view of kind of the angelic cherub-like infant that's born good. As we enter the modern study of child development and the beginnings of scientific study, some important thinkers here. One is Arnold Gesell, who said that development just kind of naturally unfolds, that we bloom with maturation that will naturally uh, unfold as we grow. G. Stanley Hall was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, and he posited that development follows an evolutionary course, that development was sort of like survival of the fittest among species, that if a behavior was the most fit for an adaptation, it would survive. You've all heard of Sigmund Freud, who suggested that children had uh, unconscious or subconscious drives and motivations that underlie their behavior. John Watson, uh, who was sort of the intellectual descendant of the John Locke view, believed that children were shaped into whatever society wished them to be by the environment. And James Mark Baldwin, whose genetic epistemology doesn't mean like genes, like chromosomes and genes. It means the beginning, like the book of Genesis. So genetic epistemology, the beginning of knowledge. And he thought that children's thinking and knowledge changed and developed over time. And he was influential to Piaget, who expanded on those ideas and identified cognitive stages that he thought that children pass through from infancy through adolescence.